Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vidam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saritam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakan Vitam Sha Om Agyantimirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Mano Bhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadha Mahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Janmadyasya yatum vayanditaratas charite shravigya swarat tene brahma hridhaya radhikavai muhyanti yasuraya tejo vari mridam yata venimayo yatra trisargo mrisha dhamna svena sadhana rastakuhakam Satyam Param Dhimahi. Hariom Tat Sat. Srimad Bhagavatam. I heard 9th canto, chapter 24, verse number 58. So I guess I show the screen here. There's the verses there. Nyan Maya Chishtitam Pungsasti Yutpatyapyayahi Anugrahasta Nivrite Atmalabhaya Cheshyate Yanmaya Cheshtitam Pungsa Stityutpatyapyayahi Anugrahasta Nivrite Atmalabhaya Cheshyate. Translation and purport by Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. So the translation, the Supreme Personality of Godhead acts through his material energy in the creation, maintenance, and annihilation of this cosmic manifestation, just to deliver the living entity by his compassion and stop the living entity's birth, death, and duration of materialistic life. Thus, he enables the living being to return home back to Godhead. Purport. Materialistic man sometimes asks why God has created the material world for the suffering of the living entities. The material creation is certainly meant for the suffering of the conditioned souls who are part of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, as confirmed by the Lord himself in Bhagavad Gita 15:7. Amai vangsho jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatana manashashtan indriyani pakriti stani karishati. Quote, the living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts. Due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. End of the quote. All the living entities are part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and are as good as the Lord qualitatively, but quantitatively, there's a great difference between them. For the Lord is unlimited, whereas the living entities are limited. Thus, the Lord possesses unlimited potency for pleasure, and the living entities have a limited pleasure potency. Anandamayo abhyasat. Both the Lord and the living entity, being qualitatively spirit, soul, have the tendency for peaceful enjoyment. But when the part of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, unfortunately, wants to enjoy independently without Krishna, he is put into the material world where he begins his life as Brahma and is gradually degraded to the status of an ant or worm in stool. This is called manashashtanindriyani prakriti karshati. There's a great struggle for existence because the living entity, conditioned by material nature, is under nature's full control. Prakriti kriyamarnani gunai karmani sarvashaha. Because of his limited knowledge, however, the living entity thinks he is enjoying in this material world. Manarshashtanenjiyani Pakritistani Karshati. He is actually under the full control of material nature, but still he thinks himself independent. Ahankara vimudhatma kartahamiti manite. Even when he is elevated by speculative knowledge and tries to merge into the existence of Brahman, the same disease continues. Aruhya kritchena parampadam tatapatantyadaha. Even having attained the parampadam, having merged into the impersonal Brahman, he falls again to the material world. In this way, the conditioned soul undergoes a great struggle for existence in this material world, and therefore the Lord, out of compassion for him, appears in this world and instructs him. Thus the Lord says in Bhagavad Gita 4:7, Yada yada hi dharmasya glanir bhavati bharata abhyutanam adharmasya tadatmanam srijamyaham. Quote, whenever and wherever there is a decline in religious practice, O descendant of Bharata, and a predominant rise of irreligion, at that time I descend myself, end quote. The real dharma is to surrender unto Krishna, but the rebellious living entity, instead of surrendering to Krishna, engages in adharma and a struggle for existence to become like Krishna. Therefore, out of compassion, Krishna creates this material world to give the living entity a chance to understand his real position. Bhagavad Gita and similar Vedic literatures are presented so that the living being may understand his relationship with Krishna. All these Vedic literatures are meant to enable the human being to understand what he is, what his actual position is, and what his relationship is with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This is called Brahma Jignasa. Every conditioned soul is struggling, but human life provides the best chance for him to understand his position. Therefore, this verse says, Anugrahastha nivritihi, indicating that the false life of repeated birth and death must be stopped, and the conditioned soul should be educated. This is the purpose of the creation. The creation does not arise whimsically as atheistic men think. Asatyam apratishtam te jagadahurenishwaram aparaspara sambhutam kemanya kama hetukam. Quote, they say that this world is unreal, that there is no foundation, and that there is no God in control. It is produced of sex desire and has no cause other than lust. Bhagavad Gita 16:8. Atheistic rascals think that there is no God and that the creation has taken place by chance. Just as a man and woman meet by chance and the woman becomes pregnant and gives birth to a child. Actually, however, this is not the fact. The fact is that there is a purpose for this creation, to give the conditioned soul a chance to return to his original consciousness, Krishna consciousness, and then return home back to Godhead and be completely happy in the spiritual world. In the material world, the conditioned soul is given a chance to satisfy his senses, but at the same time, he is informed by Vedic knowledge that this material world is not his actual place for happiness. Janma, mrityu, jara, vyadhi, dukkha, doshanudharshana. One must stop the repetition of birth and death. Every human being, therefore, should take advantage of this creation by understanding Krishna and his relationship with Krishna, and in this way, return home back to Godhead. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. So I think up to this point, we've been hearing about the dynasty that extends from Maharaj Yadhu. And as good fortune would hold for Maharaj Yadhu, Krishna appeared in that dynasty. So we're hearing about Krishna's appearance in these set of verses. And a question is being presented to us and then answered. What is the purpose for Krishna's appearance in this world? What motivates his appearance in this world? And so we're basically being provided the answer in this particular verse, that the purpose of the creation is out of mercy. Yan maya cheshtita pungsam stiti upati apyayahi. So Siti Upati Apyaya means the creation, sustenance, and destruction of the universe. So this is done by the Maya Shakti of the Supreme Lord, Yan Maya Cheshti Tampumsa. Krishna, employing his material Shakti, generates this material world, sustains it, and then dissolves it back into himself. And the purpose of this is being mentioned here as anugrahas. So the word anugrahas means compassion or mercy. So mercy to whom? That is the question. Mercy to whom? Of course, in a general sense, you can say it is mercy to the living entities in general. But our Gaudiya Siddhanta provides a little bit of a deeper insight about the target of this mercy, anugraha. So we hear from Shastra, particularly Vedanta Sutra, that the purpose of the activities of the Lord is out of the bliss of exchange with his devotees. That is the only reason, that is the only thing that inspires, you can say, activity within the absolute. Otherwise, he is inactive. In other words, the only thing that inspires his movement is the relationship that he has with his devotees. This is clearly understood when it comes to the avatars of Bhagavan that appear in this world, like Krishna or other avatars. They appear out of mercy for their bhaktas. But what about the creation of the universe? What is the purpose of the creation? So according to our philosophy, the purpose of the creation is also out of mercy for his bhaktas. That is actually why he creates the material world. That is the target of his mercy. Otherwise, he would have no impetus to create whatsoever. So this is mentioned in Bhagavad Gita. This verse is coming, Samoham Sarvabhuteshu Name Dveshosti Napriya. So Krishna is describing in this particular verse. I could pull it up here. Chapter 9, Bhagavad Gita. So in this particular verse, Krishna is saying, Samoham Sarvabhuteshu, that he assumes a position of neutrality towards all living entities in this material world. Name Dveshosti Napriya. No one in this material world is dear, or no one is an object of his envy. His position in relationship to the living entities in this world is completely neutral. That's what he says here in the first line of this verse of Bhagavad Gita. Ye bhajanti tumam bhaktya. But those who perform worship of me, bhajanti mam, with devotion, bhaktya, or through devotion, then mayite teshu chapyaham. Then he says that I am certainly like inside such persons. I am in them. Or the meaning here is that he's attached to such persons. So in this verse, the contrast that we're getting is that towards the living entities who are devoid of bhakti, the Lord assumes a position of neutrality. He's not moved or averse by them in any particular way. But in relationship to the bhakta, then he's inspired to move. He's inspired to reciprocate, inspired to perform activity because of the devotion of his devotee, which he wants to respond to. Another verse in this chapter 9, incidentally, which is kind of related to this verse, is an interesting verse. 4 and 5, Bhagavad Gita, very famous verses. Mayam tatamidham sarvam jagaravyakta murtina. So Krishna says in this verse, by my avyakta murti, so by my form, which is unmanifested living entities, I pervade the entire universe. Mayam tatamidham sarvam. So in his feature as Paramatma, he's pervading everything in this world. So nowhere you move in this world, you'll find the absence of God in one sense. He says, Mastani Sarabhutani, all living beings are standing in me or situated in me. Nachaham te shravastitaha. He says, but I am not situated in them. So this is a very interesting statement that all living, because he's all pervading, or he pervades the world, all living beings exist in him. But he's saying, I do not exist in them. So how is that possible? If you just say you pervade everything, And Krishna, of course, is generally known as the Paramatma in the heart of all living entities. Sarvasya Shamham Hridi Sannikishta. So how can he be the Paramatma in the heart of everything and also say in this particular verse that he's not in them? That all beings are in him, but he is not in them. What is the meaning there? There's an ontological explanation of this verse, and there's also an emotional explanation of the verse. So I'm going to show the emotional point because it's more interesting for our purposes in this class. The emotional point here is that although the Lord is situated in the heart, because he's situated there in neutrality, it is as if he's not situated with them at all. This is a point that Jiva Goswami makes in his Paramatma Sundarbha, Untitled 100. It's a very interesting point. Although the Lord is situated in the heart, because he's situated there as a neutral witness, it is as if he was not situated there at all. Just like when you're traveling, when you go on a trip, you may be traveling with, 100 other people on the airplane, but you don't consider that you are traveling with them. You only consider that you are traveling with your, your spouse, your children. I'm traveling with them. Actually, you're traveling with hundreds of other people who are there on the plane with you, but you only consider that you are traveling with your children or your spouse or your friends or your partner, right? It is a relationship of affection that creates that connection. Otherwise, even though you're situated around tons of people, because there is no relation of affection, it is as if you're not with them at all. Just like we joke sometimes living in New York City. If I want to have some alone time, I just go on a walk in the city. Even though you're situated in a city with millions and millions of people, no one notices you. You don't care for anyone. So it is like being there alone. Yeah, sometimes we would joke like this. If I want some alone time, I just go to a park in New York. You're basically alone because there is no relationship of affection. So similarly, although the Paramatma is situated internally because he's situated there in neutrality, it is like he's not situated there at all. So he's saying here, although I pervade everything and all beings are in me, I am not in them. And then the next verse, which was interesting, Nacha Mastani Bhutani. He says, also you should know that all these living entities, they are also not in me. Oh, what do you mean by that? Again, this has like an ontological explanation and an emotional angle. So we're sharing the emotional angle here. Because the living entities, they're standing in God. That's what we heard in the previous verse, but they're standing in God with the lack of awareness of God. So it is as if they're not situated in God whatsoever. That's why they come up with so many atheistic philosophies, because there's the absence of the awareness of God. So although God is everywhere, because they don't have the awareness of God, it's as if he's nowhere. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta says this, that the atheist says that God is nowhere or sees God nowhere, and the devotee sees God everywhere. Right? That is the difference between the devotee and the non-devotee. So here, the atheistic non-devotee, let's say. So here, the living entities, although standing in God, but they're standing there with absence of awareness of God. And therefore, it is as if they're not with God also. So this very interesting idea that is coming up. Yeah, so then, going back to our other Gita verse here, so I'm situated in the living entities with neutrality. But if those who do my bhajan, for those who do my bhakti, or worship me through bhakti, then I am in them. So earlier in chapter 9, Krishna said, I'm not in the living entities. And then in this verse, he said, I'm in the bhakta. Because of the bhaktas, bhakti, I am in them. To be in them means here to have attachment to them. And the devotee is also attached to God. So in the next verse from Gita, I just want to share this next verse just to give you more of the emotional sense of these verses for my reflection. Krishna here in 9:30. So Mayi te teshu chapiyam. So I am in such persons, the bhakta, which means here he exists in them with attachment, not with neutrality. So the next verse, Krishna says, Api cha sudaracharo. This is a famous verse also. Bhajante mama nanya bhak, Sardureva samantavya samyavyavasito hisa. So strong is his attachment, Krishna declares in this verse, even if my devotee does some very abominable activity. Api, apicha, even if that means that the devotee is not generally seen to do abominable activities. But Krishna wants to express emphatically his attachment for his bhakta. So he says, even if, no, he will not be doing, because the devotee is not attracted to sin or piety. But even if he does something abominable, because of his exclusive worship of me, Bhajanti Mama Nanyabha, I consider him sadhu. Sadhu Eva, he is certainly a sadhu. He is certainly a saintly person. And Samantavya, everyone is to consider that this is the case. Not only do I consider it, but you also consider it. I think in Sri Vishwanath's commentary, he's saying that Krishna is like hitting his chest, chastising the smarta brahmanas who would think that the devotee, because he has done an abominable activity, he cannot be a saint. No, Krishna's hitting his chest and saying, no, he is certainly a saint because of his bhajan. And then the next verse, just to complete the sequence here. Shipram bhavati dharmatma shashvat tancha nagachiti konteya pratijani nami bhakta panashati. Another famous verse. He quickly becomes righteous and attains the eternal peace. Declare it boldly, O son of Kunti, that my devotee never perishes. So these verses are expressing just the level of profound attachment that Krishna has for his bhakta. So although situated in neutrality in the living entities, in the bhakta, he is situated with attachment. And due to attachment to his bhakta, because of the bhakta's bhakti, he's inspired to perform activity. That's the point that we're making. So Jiva Goswami making a point here about this, that when it comes to the creation of the universe is also inspired by the bhakti of his devotees who are existing in the material creation, but have not yet completed have not achieved the perfection of bhakti yet. So when the Lord is doing processes of creation and destruction. So when the world is destroyed, there are many bhaktas situated inside the Mahavishnu who have yet to achieve the perfected stage of bhakti. And they desire to perfect their bhakti for the pleasure of Krishna. They want to perfect their bhakti, but how can they perfect their bhakti if they don't have any bodies by which they can continue to grow their bhakti, isn't it? You can't do any bhakti, forget bhakti. You can't pursue material sense gratification unless you have a body to do so, right? You need a body to do that. So these devotees who exist inside the Lord, with the desire to perfect their bhakti, for the pleasure of Krishna, they need bodies to do so. So in reciprocation with the desire of the bhakti-filled desire of his devotees, the Lord is inspired to generate the creation, to show mercy to these devotees whose bhakti-informed desire to come to the perfected stage of bhakti for the pleasure of Krishna may be actualized. So his anugraha is directly aimed at bhaktas and reciprocation with their bhakti-filled desire. I think Jiva Goswami writes in Anuchet 100 of Paramatma Sundara, which I'm taking some ideas from. He even goes on to say that the Lord does not even create, in one sense, for his own purpose. He's not inspired by his own purposes, but rather he's inspired by the desire. He's inspired to reciprocate with the bhakti of his devotees. So in one sense, you can say bhakti is the cause of creation, which is a very interesting sort of idea. Bhakti, the desire for bhakti, is itself the cause of the creation, because Krishna, as Paramatma, he is also Bhagavan, wanting to reciprocate with that desire, expands the universes. And incidentally, the other living entities, they also get their bodies by which they can pursue their material sense gratification. So there's a nice verse in this regard that is also referenced by our acharyas. Buddhendriya manoprana jana namasha jat prabhu matratra cha bhavartam cha atmane akalpanaya cha. So this verse is coming in the beginning of the 87th chapter of the 10th canto, most philosophical chapter of the entire 10th canto. The chapter opens up with a question that Krishna, being transcendental, is beyond words, in the true sense, words insofar as they're being empirical or of Prakriti, then God is beyond Prakriti. So he's beyond the words. So how can you describe God? If your words are made of Prakriti, the matter, and God is beyond matter, how you can talk about him? And yet, when Parikshit Maharaj is asked this question, the whole 10th canto is almost concluded. So he's talked so much about Krishna's pastimes, but Krishna is beyond matter. So how you can talk? He is anirdesha. He's basically beyond description. So in response to this question of Parikshit Maharaj, Shukadeva Goswami speaks this verse, Buddhindriya Manoprana, Jananam Ashija Prabhu. So he says the Prabhu, the word Prabhu refers to the Supreme Lord. So he says the Prabhu, he creates Ashtajat, he is creating the intelligence, the mind, the life air, the senses, Buddhindriya Manoprana. He creates all the faculties of the living entities, right? And by those faculties, they can describe matter. The sort of subtle answer that he's giving here is that if God's mercy did not give you the faculties that you have now, then even this world of matter would be as indescribable as God himself. So who is giving you the faculties by which you can understand matter? That is God only. So by this, just by God's mercy, you can understand matter. So by God's mercy, you can also understand spirit and describe it. By the same mercy that you pursue matter, by that same mercy, you can pursue spirit and understand it. You can be empowered to understand it. So he uses this word, matrartha chabhavartam cha, atmane akalpanaya cha. So this means basically the pursuit of dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. So if you want to pursue matter, and God is the one who's given the body, basically the faculties by which it could be pursued. So if you want to pursue spirit and understanding, then that is God's mercy also. That's the point in that particular verse. So the mercy shown to the living entities by which they can pursue their material desires, that mercy is incidental. That's the point I'm trying to bring out. That is an incidental mercy, at least from this angle that we're sharing from Jiva Goswami. That is an incidental mercy. And the mercy that's aimed at the devotees is the primary mercy. He's really inspired by their own bhakti-filled desire for love and as perfection, love as beatitude. That desire is so powerful that it's inspiring the Lord to create the entire cosmos. And incidentally, the other living entities, they also get the mercy of God in the form of getting bodies by which they can pursue their various self-interest programs. But even that mercy is due to the devotee's desire for perfection and love. That is the main inspiration. So here, this is also mentioned in this particular verse we're looking at. Anugrahas tanivritir atma labhaya ishyate. So the purpose of the creation is Atma Labhaya. This word Atma Labhaya means the attainment of the Atma. So the word Atma here can refer to anything really, but the word Atma here refers to the Supreme Lord. Ultimately, the purpose is the attainment of the Atma, the attainment of God, ultimately. The word Atma primarily denotes the absolute truth. Vedantita tatavidas tatnam yashkanama dvayam. So this word Atma primarily denotes the absolute reality. And only in a secondary sense, it may refer to the soul or to the body or to the mind. So the real purpose is the Atma Labhaya, the attainment of the Atma. So the way Prabhupada is dealing with this idea here in the purport is that the jivas who are part and parcel of the Lord, they exist in the world in ignorance. And due to their ignorance, they're suffering various conditions, which can be divided into three, a triad of misery, the triad of pain. What is that triad? Misery is caused by our own body and mind. Misery is caused by other people's bodies and mind. Adibhotika klesha, the bed bugs, the mosquitoes, the government, this thing and that other thing. And the misery is caused by the devatas. So we are all afflicted by these threefold miseries, and it's quite heavy and profound. But the reason we're experiencing that is due to a fundamental suffering, which is known as ignorance. And ignorance means the absence of awareness of God. And as a result of that, the absence of awareness of our own true nature. So this is the real cause of our suffering. Not being aware of the cause of our suffering, we keep on trying to solve the problem by pursuing matter. So this strategy is called dukkha oshadam ta'api dukkam. Dukkha oshadam means the remedy for suffering. So the living entities, because they are atadiyaham, dukkha oshadam ta'api dukkam atadiyaham. Because the living entities are atadiyaham means they're in ignorance. They suffer from absence of awareness of God and of their own true nature. So due to that, the remedies that they discover for their suffering is itself suffering. The remedy for suffering is itself suffering, because they don't know what is the root cause of their suffering. So in this way, they go on in this material world suffering like anything. But at a certain point, when the suffering reaches a climax, or you can say a crescendo, then certain living entities, they become inspired to search out more deeply the very root of their suffering. And this way, with that inquisitive spirit, which Prabhupada is referred to in the purport as Brahma Jignasa, combined with the fortuitous association with great souls, particularly the bhaktas, Mahat Sevam Dwara Mahur Vimukti. The door of liberation is then open to them in the form of proper knowledge, informing them of the root cause of their misery. And then, having heard the root cause of the misery and the solution to that, then they can pursue it. Shrutekshita nanupata nanunata pungsa. This is called the path of first hearing from Guru, and after hearing, performing the sadhana, and then after performing the sadhana, seeing the absolute truth and experiencing the bliss thereof. So this is ultimately the purpose. Atmalabhaya cha ishyate. This is ultimately the purpose. The living entities could suffer. That suffering leads to Brahma Jignasa at a certain point. That Brahma Jignasa spirit, combined with the fortuitous association of bhaktas or great souls, then leads to them attaining the Supreme Lord. So this is the purpose of creation, to give that opportunity to living entities. An opportunity that is not otherwise possible without material bodies. If they're just locked in the body of Mahavishnu. So this is the kindness of the Supreme Lord. He creates, giving us a chance for experiencing perfection in love, ultimately, as far as our school is concerned. Such is the kindness of the Lord. So just as the Lord is inspired to create out of anugraha, so similarly, out of the same anugraha, the Lord is inspired to descend in the world that he creates. That is the answer that is being given here. So the question was, why does God descend in the world? So here they're saying, well, just as God creates the world by anugraha, so by the same anugraha, he descends inside the world. And descending, he teaches. By those teachings, we can move towards our perfection in life. And by his activities, if we hear them and regularly, we can also achieve that same perfection. So by his teachings and also by his acts, so this is the reason the Lord appears. It is because of anugraha. That is the answer that we're hearing. So I'm going to stop there. It is now 7:50. I always try to leave about 10 minutes for comments and questions and participation.
Krishna, Jai Jagannath Prabhu. Can I throw in a comment?
Sure, please.
Thank you. Wonderful class. I was just thinking a few months ago, what's the purpose of a bed bug? According to the Shastra, every living being has a purpose, and Krishna is present in them, and they are in our life, like bed bugs are in our life for a reason. But I was thinking, but what purpose are they serving? What is this higher dharma that this bed bug has, and what's Krishna trying to introduce in my life through a bed bug? And I was thinking, yeah, probably out of all these species, the bed bug is probably the most useless. They don't serve any purpose, apparently. But then today, when you shastrically put the government in the same category as a bed bug, and explain to us how their purpose is to give us botheration, this triad of misery. And it finally, everything fell into place for me. Yes, the bed bugs are there in our life to serve the purpose of botheration, which
Yes, you
is
can say, I would say that's a very nice comment. I would say it, if I had to articulate it in a way that might sound slightly sweeter, everything in the creation is moving towards Krishna. And
even
everything
bed
in the
bugs. It's
creation,
amazing.
everything in the creation is also intended to move us towards Krishna. So the bed bug is
Is that
giving
what
the
bed bugs are
suffering,
doing? They're moving us to
and the
Krishna.
bed bug gives the suffering, or the government, or whoever, and that also inspires us to move towards the center. The center is
Who could have
Krishna.
thought bed bugs are moving us closer to Krishna? This is Krishna
Living entities,
consciousness.
they misunderstand because of separate interests. So there's universal purpose and there's provincial purposes. The universal purpose is to move us towards the center, towards God. That is God's purpose. But we analyze the environment from our provincial purposes, right? Our individual purposes. So then we misunderstand, and then we start blaming the environment. So once we correct that attitude, because that is the only way you can deal with suffering. This is an interesting thing as a general point. The only way you can deal with a suffering that you can't change, some sufferings you can do something about, and then naturally we correct it. But certain sufferings you can do nothing about, like death, for example, or in the
bed
right
bugs
now,
are
government.
difficult to deal with.
So when you have a suffering that you don't have the power to change, the only strategy to deal with it is to change your attitude. The attitudinal approach is the only solution to that sort of suffering. So we can change our attitude. What is the attitude? Right now, our attitude is that we're looking at the environment from our egocentric reference point. So we misunderstand what's happening. But if we look at the same environment from the universal reference point, the reference point of God, then it actually is moving us toward Him only. And that way we can be reconciled to our own suffering. Otherwise, it becomes impossible from the provincial perspective. And we just say, why this bed bug? Why this government? Why this, Omicron? Why this? Why that? And then we keep crying and complaining about it. Okay, Shashaka Prabhu has something to say.
Hare Krishna, please accept my obeisances and please accept my friend request. I tried to tag you, but
I'm not so good at the Facebook. I'll go and check it out.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a pile of garbage, basically. But if you use it for preaching, it can be effective.
Sure.
But what is I kind of joined the class a little late. What is the definition of anugraha?
Anugraha means mercy.
Oh, okay. So I was always under the impression that this material world was created because we wanted to desire enjoy separately from Krishna.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're saying that it's the mercy. It's an interesting point that it's Krishna's mercy on his devotees.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, absolutely.
So the thing is, I just saw a quote. I was kind of thinking about this yesterday because everybody wants to be optimistic, in this material world. And Prabhupada says the material world is miserable, regardless of one's standard of life.
Mm-hmm.
Of this, there's no doubt. Attempts to mitigate the miseries of material existence by material methods will never be successful.
Mm-hmm.
One must take to Krishna consciousness to become really happy. Otherwise, happiness is impossible.
Right.
So in the midst of all these calamities that were, bed bugs, the downfall of democracy, climate change, what to speak of the pandemic. So this is Krishna's mercy on us. I understand that it's helping us move toward, Krishna, but why would anybody want to come here? What is the reason for material existence, and how is it a gift?
Well, this sort of question is a little bit hard to answer because, the material universe is eternal, right? So something eternal doesn't have a beginning or end to it, right? That is a definition of eternal, without any beginning and without an end. Of course, there's beginning and ends to the cycles of creation. So we speak about a creation and destruction, but that there's no beginning to that cycle. So anything that doesn't have a beginning in a technical sense doesn't really have a cause relationship in the normal way that we think about it. For example, God is eternal. You accept that. We all accept that. God is eternal. So that means there was no beginning to God. Nothing caused God to exist because he is without the beginning and without end. That is the meaning of his eternality. So just as God is eternal, so all of his potencies are eternal. So in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, God has three primary powers: his spiritual power, his external power that creates the material world, and the jivas, right? The internal power. These are the three powers. So just as God is eternal, so all of his powers are also eternal, which means not having any beginning or end. Here's a simple analogy for that. The sun and the sun rays are co-eternal, right? There was never a time when there was the sun, and then later on the sun rays came. They are coexisting together, although the sun ray is depending on the sun for its existence. Although that is true, still it is co-eternal with the sun. Does that make sense, that analogy?
Yeah, everything is eternal. But basically my question is why is this material world created for devotees if it's just a place of suffering? And also it's kind of interesting because, they put up this big, telescope recently,
Okay.
$10 billion.
Mm-hmm.
It's called the James Webb telescope.
Sure.
And the person that was a Nobel Prize winning laureate, he was saying that they don't know anything about how the galaxies or the universe or when it happened or anything, but they're going to find out because they've sent up this satellite to measure the heat radiation right after the Big Bang.
Mm-hmm.
So
Another lie.
they're spending $10 billion looking in the wrong place
Mm-hmm.
for all
Cheating
this
the innocent
information.
people, taking more money somehow or other.
Exactly, and they can live high off the hog.
So now the question to their answer is this, well, we're trying to get to it, that the world is eternal. It's always existed, just as God has always existed. So the sort of, you can say, defect in your question is you're thinking about a time when the world did not exist and then God brought it into existence. So this is a defect in the thinking in that question, because there was never a time where the world did not exist and then God brought it into existence. Like I said, there are beginnings and ends of creations, but the cycle process has been going on for eternity. So the world has always existed. There was never a time when the world did not exist. And so just as the world has always existed, there's always been souls in this world conditioned by it. There's no meaning to a material world without the conditioning of souls in it. So in that way, there have always been souls in this world pursuing sense gratification, some of them pursuing yoga, and then some of them pursuing bhakti. That has always been there from, you can say, time eternal, for eternity. So the defect in the question, or not the defect, I should say the confusion that the question causes, is that we think that, oh, the world didn't exist and then God brought it into existence. And we can't understand why he would do that, because the world is filled with so much suffering. Why would he make it that way? So in Indic philosophical thought, and Gaudiya Vaishnavism included, no, the world was never not existing and then brought into being. It has always existed. There's always been souls pursuing sense gratification in this world. And then there's always been souls pursuing devotion in this world. And then out of mercy for those souls pursuing devotion, but who have yet to perfect their devotion, God continues to create the world, in these cycles over and over again, to give all souls the opportunity to move towards their perfection in love. And that's wonderful news, because it's not one strike and you're out. It's as many strikes as it takes until you get that perfection in love. And so this is our good news. This is good tidings.
I was just going to say, I wanted to complete my thought about that telescope. These scientists say that the universe never has always existed. Therefore, they don't have to explain the creation. That's another one of their.
Yeah, some of them speculate like that. But because the universe is itself a contingent entity, then the question naturally comes, what causes it? Even if it is existing eternally, as they say, because it's dependent on so many contingent forces, that leads to the question, well, what is the underpinning for that thing? So you come to this sort of weird philosophical thing where you either have an infinite regress, where you keep asking, well, what is the cause of that? Well, what is the cause of that? Well, what is the cause of that? Or you have to accept that there's an uncaused first cause of everything, which is the theistic paradigm, where you say, actually, God's the uncaused cause of the world. There's that side, or there's the other side where you just have an infinite regress of causes, because this is a cause and effect world after all. So,
well, it's if go ahead.
So there always be this sort of philosophical confusion there with this sort of thing.
If the living entities are uncaused, and they're eternal, and the universe is also eternal, so what's the difference between the universe and living entities and God?
No, very good question. So Prabhupada has brought this up here also in the purport a little bit. For start, and simply put, because our time is basically over. For starters, the difference between God and living entity is that God is infinite and the living entity is finite. So Prabhupada has specifically made that point here. So the finite living entity is dependent on the infinite living entity, just as the sun ray is dependent on the sun globe and not the other way around, right? So that is the difference between God and living entity. The difference between the world and God, and this is explained also, the world is compared to a reflection of light of the sun. So the reflection of light is also dependent on the existence of the sun, right? But it is existing outside of the sun, but has dependence on the sun. So the world is unconscious, whereas God is conscious. So that is another major difference between the world and God. So the world is unconscious, God is unconscious. The world is dependent on the existence of God, and God is independent of or not supported by the world. So that is a difference. The difference between a living entity and the world is that the living entity is conscious, although finite consciousness, and the world is unconscious. And the world has a tendency to eclipse the consciousness of the soul in the same way that a cloud can cover a sun ray, and therefore we're not able to perceive light as clearly. So all these distinctions they're made, they're important questions, and they're answered very deeply in the Srimad Bhagavatam. So it is worth our time to study it more and more and more, and gain more and more clarity, so that we are more and more inspired to move towards our perfection and love of God. Thank you,
Krishna,
Prabhu, for your questions. And I thank you all for tolerating me this morning. They're very kind of you. Thank you all very much. I'll see you all later. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Jai.
Namaskar Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Shri Gaudiya Guru Varga ki jai. Go Premanandi Haribo. We can't hear you. Ananda Bihari Prabhu.
This is why we bring Jai Jagannath Prabhu to give class. This is why, dear devotees, he can answer very deep questions in a very simple and relatable way. There hasn't been a time where bed bugs didn't exist. There hasn't been a time where Jai Jagannath Prabhu said no to our request to him to give class. Thank you, Jai Jagannath Prabhu. Happy New Year.
Happy
all
New
of
Year,
you.
everyone.
Hare Krishna, we love you. Yogeshwari, Pat, Jamuna, Jaya, Isabel, Gail, Dion, Andrea, Amish, Kikuji. Hare Krishna. Happy New Year. Haribol.